Hey, so I think that the central ideas of Chapter 5 of Division 1 of Being and Time have already come out in the last lecture where I talked about mood, understanding, and discourse. Um, so I want to look at the text to show you where he says those things. But I don't particularly want to just go over those same points again. I'll try to bring out a couple of different things, some of which is just going more deeply into those issues, into the text, but some of which is sort of extrapolating from it a little bit and thinking a little bit more about it, especially with respect to the theme of language. But anyway, so Heidegger talks about all three of these things: mood, understanding, and discourse. And like I just said, I wanted to talk about language, but all three of them are so provocative and insightful in the things he says. The way he opens up the theme of mood, or what you would loosely call emotion. I say loosely because in that everyday way of speaking, we don't really much grasp what it is we're talking about. And what he's doing is a pretty rigorous analysis of what that reality is. The stuff he says there is quite profound, and it's not like nobody ever said anything like that before. But there's a real way in which his saying these things about mood in this book opened up a whole field of study of the meaningfulness of our moods and so on. That's really powerful. The discussion about understanding what the stuff he says there is great too. Off the top of my head, I hope I don't regret saying this later, but off the top of my head, I would say that the things he says there largely are kind of consonant with what one might already have expected with Husserl or so on and so on. So I'm not sure that stuff is profound, and if you haven't studied it before, it's amazing. I'm not sure that is exactly original with him. The stuff on language, then, however, is again a place where he is remarkable in the creativity and provocativeness of his thinking. And all three of those things, but especially language, I think. He goes on to explore more in other writings, but language becomes a huge theme for him throughout his whole career. So this text here is kind of it's short, but it's a really great. It's kind of like a seed text. Like you can pull so much out of these ideas. But so like I said, I really want to say more about language than the other two. But I'm going to start by talking about mood, and you'll see that there's quite a bit in here. Okay, let me find it. So this is section 29, being there as state of mind. It's called. So first of all, he's talking about these existential dimensions of Dasein's existence, these different dimensions of our being in. And so what we were talking about mood, what he calls it is Befindlichkeit, which is translated here as state of mind. Not a great translation because the word state doesn't fit well and the word mind doesn't fit well. Even the word of might not fit that well. In other words, all the things that are kind of said in that English expression, though in a certain way they conjure up what he's talking about, that language is really misleading. So what it really means is, what the word means is essentially how you find yourself, and the idea that we've been getting at is that you find yourself situated. But the way you find yourself situated, first and foremost, is not in the form of theoretical, detached observation. The way you find yourself situated first is just being emotionally, let's say, gripped by the reality of the situation. You're first and foremost, the situation that you are just kind of impinges upon you in that you feel it. And so he says, we indicate ontologically, and there he means, when he says ontologically, there he means what we indicate when we're talking about the constitutive dimensions of our reality as experiencing beings. What we indicate ontologically by the term Befindlichkeit is ontically, that is to say, with respect to the specific things of which we have experience, is ontically the most familiar and everyday sort of thing. Our mood, we're very familiar with moods and emotions and so on. But he wants to say, okay, those things are pointing to a constitutive dimension of our experience, not one or the other things we might or might not happen to encounter in experience, but a structure of the very way we're engaged in the world always, right? And he says, our mood or our being attuned, right? Which is that's the word Stimmung, which, as I said before, can be either a word for mood in that sense of emotion, or it can also mean more the notion of an attunement. And so, and he really wants to play on that, right? A mood is how you're attuned to the world, which I talked about a little bit before. But he said, but I just want to go on. So he says, what's a mood like? Well, he says prior to all psychology of moods, it's necessary to see this phenomenon as a fundamental existentiality, right? So the point is, yeah, we're not going to interpret moods on the model of that we often have of thinking of the mind as this separate substance that has these contents inside it, and one of the things you sometimes get is a mood and so on. Like, we're not doing that kind of thing at all. What we want to do, on the contrary, is see mood as a fundamental dimension of the way reality is disclosed to us. And so let's just skip ahead for a second. On page 176, he says, the mood, this is 5 lines down, the mood has already disclosed in every case being in the world as a whole, and makes it possible, first of all, to direct oneself towards something. That's probably the most important sentence in that whole section. I'm not going to bring out all the importance yet. I might try to bring out a bit more in a minute. The thing I really want just to get there now, or get from there now, is that reference to as a whole. Right? What do moods do first? First, they kind of give you the feeling of the whole. Right? They're like the first most basic statement of what the meaning of everything is. So, I tried to bring this out and talking about those Jeff Wall images before a bit, but when you're, I'll use our everyday words, sad, angry, whatever. Like, those are not particular articulate words. Like, they mean something, but that's a pretty insufficient discourse for talking about the complexity of our emotional life. If you think of music, which largely plays with our moods, and you think of the varieties of ways you can feel with music, that might give you a better sense of what a range of complexity there is. And we can work to articulate. Language is a very subtle instrument too, and a supple instrument, but it tends to take effective use of language, like somebody saying a number of things well, to really be able to communicate what a mood is like, rather than just having a word, I'm sad, but I'm going to stick for the moment with those I'm sad kind of expressions anyway. So when you say you're sad, like, you say I am sad, and we're used to using that word, and we refer it to ourselves, I am sad, and we make it sound like it's about ourselves, and that way of talking fits with that notion of the psychology of moods, right? The idea that these are private subjective states. But phenomenologically, what it's actually like to experience sadly, or to experience when you're sad, is typically that the world or the situation as a whole feels a certain way to you. Maybe the world feels like you can't have it anymore. So how would I describe that in terms of the world? The world feels like something lost to you. You may already feel nostalgia for an engagement with the world you used to have that you can't have anymore. Or when you're just involved in the first blush of new love, new romance, that same world that yesterday seemed dull, like suddenly when you start going with this person or whatever, the world can seem like just sparkling. It can just seem like everything is great. Oh, it's raining. That's great. Oh, that person did something obnoxious. Oh, isn't that funny? Oh, I sliced my finger. Oh, it just reminds me of the vulnerability of life, and like whatever. Like you can that sense of a sort of emerging romance isn't just a feeling in your body or in your head. It's the way the world as a whole appears to you. Right? When you're angry, and let's say really angry, right? When you're in a rage, or something like that, because someone, your dad, your partner, whoever it is, your boss, somebody at the store, has really mistreated you, right? The things around you, the bookcase or whatever, can seem like an offense. Like sometimes it can just feel like the stuff in the world is burning you or something like that. Or it's just, and like consequently, your anger can lead you not so much to want to hit that person, although maybe you want to do that, but you just want to get that stuff away from there, because that sense of I am being wronged can be something that you kind of feel in the way all the stuff around you, how it seems to you, right? So those are some quick attempts to give little sort of phenomenological sketches of what some different emotional states are like. I hope that the things that I said remind you of your own experience and they sound plausible to you. If they don't, maybe you could work out more on your own. But I hope that those are familiar enough examples that allow you to see that, yeah, fundamentally what it is to experience a mood is to experience the world as seeming a certain way. And as I tried to bring out in talking about those pictures, when the world seems a certain way, that has implications for, as a whole, when the world as a whole seems a certain way, that has implications for the meaning of particular things, right? Because certain ways of interacting with this or that thing that used to seem available suddenly seem unavailable, right? The very significance of individual things can change. Like when you're angry, just can't imagine now sitting down and having dinner with that person. Whereas when you're feeling in love, like what could be better? Or when you're sad, that same thing might happen too. So another way to put that same point is to flip the order of the terms around. The ability to experience certain specific things that you might interact with in certain ways, to experience certain possibilities for interacting, to a significant degree depends on being in the right mood. Such that if you're angry or sad, there's just certain kinds of things you can't do because the world doesn't realistically speak to you in those ways. I should have found another picture of people in a sort of sexual embrace or something like. Well, like you could imagine that picture, the kiss by Gustav Klimt. It shows these people in an embrace, and try to imagine what it's like, and in a way, when you're in that situation, the other person seems more or less your whole world. I mean, this is, I guess, when it's that first romantic kiss or whatever. There's a familiar sort of thing from movies, like you can be in that kind of embrace, and then your cell phone buzzes, right? That by itself can wreck the mood. What will really wreck the mood, though, if it wasn't wrecked, is if you answer it and take the call. Because the world as it is disclosed in that feeling of romance and erotic passion is not a world in which that sort of prosaic instrumental carrying out of your day's business activities is a possibility, right? To get into that romantic erotic mood, you have to basically say no to that instrumental relationship to things. And so if you answer the phone and start talking to the person, you've left that world of romance, and you're doing something that didn't fit with that mood, and consequently that mood will be lost. And you probably have to, well, not even just probably, you basically have to adopt a new mood. You kind of have to get out of your absorption in that romantic thing and pull yourself back to the feeling of a certain kind of neutrality and tranquility with respect to the world, a certain sense of confidence in yourself as an agent. You got to become that businesswoman or that businessman again and answer the phone and so on. And, both you and your partner will recognize the falseness of you hanging up the phone and just trying to get right back into where you were. The two of you might decide that you want to try to recultivate that experience, but you won't just have it. You will have to recultivate it. And it may very well happen. It may be by the fact that the two of you try to get back together into that erotic moment that you actually do start to feel those things again, and you let yourself get taken over by those feelings. But it either does or it doesn't happen, right? Your simple decision to do that isn't going to make it so, right? You're trying to let an experience come over you, kind of like you try to fall asleep. And actually, let me just pick up on that last point, right? So the point I was making there was basically about how certain activities are or are not possible in certain moods, or how you need a certain mood to engage in certain kinds of activities. Now but in talking about trying to get back into that erotic, romantic mood, let me make another point, and that is that emotions, are what traditionally, since the Greeks, we've called the pathe. A pathos is singular. And a pathos is something you suffer, or which, in more straightforward English, it's something you undergo, not something you do. So it's the opposite of an action would be a pathos. Instead of you going out and doing something, you undergo something. Something happens to you, and that's the way, the phenomenological way, actually, that the whole tradition of philosophy has typically talked about the moods as things that we undergo, things that come over us. And so that's my point here, that when I compare the erotic mood or whatever to sleep, right, you can try to get back into that mood, but it has to be the case that mood takes you over, right? So that's a second thing. The first thing I wanted to say then was that with that quotation from 176, that moods disclose being as a whole first and foremost. And then the second thing is that the sort of side point is that it's a matter of passivity. It's a pathos, not an action or something like that, not something deliberate. The people in that case deliberately try to make it happen, but it has to happen. And indeed, that deliberateness can often be the thing that keeps it from happening, because you've got to lose that deliberate frame of mind to be in that passive state of erotic absorption or something like that. A couple of other things here. I was talking before about our vocabulary. I'm sad, I'm angry is kind of heavy-handed, not very good at capturing the real complexity of our moods. Well, I want to read something and I said that music in some ways might help to display the range of possible moods better in some cases. Well, he doesn't say exactly that, but he says something related to that on page 175. About halfway down the page, he says, we must not be misled by this into denying that ontologically, here's the point, ontologically, mood is a primordial kind of being for Dasein, in which Dasein is disclosed to itself prior to all cognition and volition and beyond their range of disclosure. Well, I'm going to get back to the notion that Dasein is disclosed to itself in a minute. I'm going to lead back to that. But I want that last part, that whatever is disclosed in mood, the kind of disclosure that mood is prior to all cognition and volition and beyond their range of disclosure. I mean, I guess I was already talking about it being beyond the volition in the sense that it's not something you will, it's something that has to happen. But it's beyond cognition in the sense that moods aren't concepts. So we can try to explain what it's like to be in a mood for sure. We can try to explain the possibilities and the meaning of it, and that's real. But you could never just translate a mood into an idea, right? Moods are a revelation of the immediacy of things in this affective way. That is a different kind of disclosure than theoretical or conceptual cognition. And it's not just that it's weaker; it's that it discloses things. Your emotions show things that your ideas don't, your concepts don't get to. Right? But also, it's prior to cognition and volition. So that's, I think, the last point I want to make about this is that I was saying before that mood is in a way the original experience of being there, of there is. And so whatever cognition is ever going to happen is going to be on the basis of this. It's going to be something that takes place within the world disclosed in mood, and with the resources disclosed in mood. Right? So a further thing then for you to think about. And now to get back about what is disclosed. Basically, he says, I'll read you a couple of things. He says, on 173, halfway down, he refers to the primordial disclosure belonging to moods, in which Dasein is brought before its being as there. And that's the two things. Its being as there. Those are the two things I just want to talk about. So first, the there. So in a real basic way, mood gives you there is. Right? It is you. It is yourself. Going back to Befindlichkeit, or what they're translating as state of mind, you find yourself situated. This is it. This is happening. I am here. Like you experience, in a basic way, that the fact of the happening of experience, and that's what Heidegger calls facticity. That's on page 174. The facticity of its being delivered over. Like you find yourself thrown into a world. And that's in fact, he uses that exact word, thrownness. So that fact of thrownness, that is, it's not a fact like one day this happened and one day that happened. It's not an optional thing. It is the fact that our very existence is always thrown. The simple fact of experience is already having been thrown into being. Or what does he say? Already being delivered over. So mood is like that most basic way in which you experience that simple facticity of the situatedness of your experience. The way that way you experience, wow, this is happening and I can't get out of it. Right? There's no exit from this. This being here now, that just is me. Which could be exciting, or it could be terrifying, or it could be boring, could be all kinds of things. So this is the initial disclosure of the there. But as he says, it's the disclosure of its being as there, of Dasein's being as there, because you are Dasein. So in disclosing the there, it is disclosing that you are thrown. And so it is disclosing that you are the kind of thing who experiences. So mood at the most basic level is the original experiencing of your reality as being in the world. And what that means is, in the experience of mood, it is actually always possible for you to discover your own being. But precisely because it discloses the world as a whole, we tend, like as in everything else, we tend to think about our situation from the world, from the determinacies. But our reality as experiencers is always disclosed in mood. And so moods do give us the opportunity to notice about ourselves, our subjectivity. For the moment, I'm not going to say more about that. I think that next week, next time, I'll come back and try to pick up on that a little bit. I want to just say one last thing about this. I think this is the last one. Yeah. He says, with that quote I read on 176, the mood has already disclosed in every case being in the world as a whole, and makes it possible, first of all, to direct oneself towards something. Right? There is your original experiencing of yourself as in some kind of meaningful situation, and mood is kind of the original sense of its meaning as a whole. And as I said, it's within that cognition or volition becomes possible as a sort of responsiveness to that already givenness of the meaningful whole. But he says that this is what makes it possible for us to direct our attention towards something, right? So something can rise to prominence within that. So that just picks up on that idea before, and I wanted just to bring out a little bit more of that kind of the epistemological significance of that, the significance of that for our understanding of what knowledge is. A few more lines down, he says, as we have already said earlier, the world which has already been disclosed beforehand permits what is within the world to be encountered. right? So, when you think of yourself as going out and acting, when you think of yourself as going out and thinking about something, those things are possible only because you are already in the world with those things, right? It's only because you are already meaningfully engaged with the world that you can do something more specific. So the knowings and the actings that we tend to take as our starting point for thinking about our experience are in fact secondary. They're founded, so to speak, on a more basic reality that is the disclosure of being, basically disclosure of reality that happens in mood, which is our initial finding ourself meaningfully there. And then the last thing he says, um, actually, let's read on 177. If being in the world is 6 lines down, I think, if being in the world with its Befindlichkeit, its state of mind, had not already submitted itself to having entities within the world matter to it in a way which its moods have outlined in advance. Um, oh, then he says nothing like an emotion would come. So I shouldn't have read that if. But the point is, state of mind is what mood is what initially is the experience of mattering, right? It sets the initial terms of how there can be something mattering to you. And so then he says, existentially, a state of mind, Befindlichkeit, implies a disclosive submission to the world out of which we can encounter something that matters to us, right? So just sort of repeating that point, but I really want to stress that idea that this is, in that sense, fundamental or prior to, or the very fabric out of which those more everyday acts of cognition or volition that we think about come to be. Okay, now, excuse me, to understand the next section of the chapter, being there as understanding, or being in the world is an enactment of understanding, we should refer back to some stuff he already said back in chapter 3 in section 18. So chapter 3 was the section on the world for the world, and we talked before about first about sections 15 and 16, I think it is, where he talks about the experience of equipment as what is ready to hand, and distinguishes that from the object that confronts you as something present at hand. And so that's the context in which we talked about the workspace and the network of involvements and so on. And so in that same lump of sections, which I guess is section 14 to 18, where he really covers that stuff, section 18 deals with very similar material to this section here on understanding, so it's good to read them together. And basically what he says there, well, I might read a passage or two. Basically what he says there is that when you think about equipment, when you think about tools and so on, those things are assigned. And what he means by that is basically you relate to the thing in terms of something you're trying to do. And so the very meaning of the hammer is that it's assigned to a certain task within that, a specific task within the larger project of whatever it is you're trying to do. Right? So equipment has a kind of assignment. It's the thing you work with to do this thing. But furthermore, you work with this thing to do this thing, and that's all in the service of a goal that you have, right? So there is something for the sake of which you are doing this hammering of the nail, right? So the hammer is what you work with to hammer the nail, but the hammering of the nail in is for the sake of putting the picture up on the wall or something like that. So equipment is always experienced in that context of being assigned to a task in the larger context of that for the sake of which you're operating. But he says that stuff about assignment on the bottom of 115. If something has an involvement, this implies letting it be involved in something. The relationship of the with in shall be indicated by assignment or reference. But then he also says the 116 at the bottom, the primary towards which, I guess, that you're working on something is a for the sake of which. Right? I'm just showing you where some of those terms come up, assignment and for the sake of which and so on in section 18. But there he makes, right after that sentence I just read, he makes an important point. He says, so he's saying, that basic way you experience things that we were talking about, in that your ready involvement with the world where you're oriented towards some task, is that, you're doing this for the sake of that thing you're after, putting the picture up or something. But putting the picture up is for the sake of something too. Like maybe it's for the sake of having a beautiful room. Why do you want a beautiful room? Well, that's for the sake of having a place to entertain friends. And that's for the sake of having good social and interpersonal relationships. And that's for the sake of having a happy life, right? My point is that there are sort of nested relationships of for the sake of which, right? And you do this for a purpose which is contextualized by a larger purpose or a larger project. Well, but that ultimate project is really going to be you being you, right? That's, in a way, what it's all about is you living out the basic demands of your existence. And so in a very basic way, the ultimate for the sake of which is your own Dasein, your own being in the world. That's what it's all sort of about. So he makes that point in here that he says at the bottom of 116, but the for the sake of always pertains to the being of Dasein, for which in its being, that very being is essentially an issue. We have thus indicated the interconnection by which the structure of involvements leads to Dasein's very being as the sole authentic for the sake of which. So he's not going to pursue that further here, and we're going to bring that up more next week. But I hope here already, in just a kind of a quick way, you can think, oh yeah, I'm at stake in all those things, and so in a significant way, whatever I'm doing is going to be about me, and therefore, if we were talking about this is for the sake of hammering and so on, or I use this hammer for the sake of putting up the picture and so on, right? That means we're always dealing with things in terms of their possibilities, what the possibilities the world offers. But those things are also always possibilities of me, right? So that with that basic context in mind, you can read an awful lot of the stuff in this section that I was just going to talk about, understanding in Division 1, Chapter 5. So, first of all, he says in section 31, right at the beginning, a state of mind always has its understanding, and understanding always has its mood, right? So again, he's saying, so he's really trying to get away from you thinking of a mood as a thing in your consciousness and understanding as a particular cognitive activity you engage in, and trying to get you to think instead of how you inhabit a world. And the point is, inhabitation is always affectively charged, and that pertains to the experienced meaning as a whole of that situation into which you're thrown, how it draws you or repels you or whatever, how it makes you feel, and that experience of the world in that way already involves understanding. It's not that you might go out and perform an explicit cognitive act upon it of trying to understand something. Rather, you already are understanding that. Or another way of saying that is, it's already appearing to you in an understandable way, in a meaningful way, right? That before you ever engage in explicit acts of thinking about this and trying to figure stuff out, the world has already appeared to you in a way that makes sense, not just in the overall affective coloring, but in the sense of you grasping how certain things fit together, and how the what of something is related to the what of something else, and so his point is, experientially, a grasp of the sense of things and a feeling of the whole are the very fabric of all experience, right? That's always happening. And that significance then that's always disclosed is Dasein is already always implied in that, right? And that's the point I was just making about the sort of ultimate for the sake of which. Um, okay. And then he says, I was saying that what you're really understanding is the possibilities of things, and that in turn is basically your possibilities. And that's more or less what he's saying on 183, about being definite possibilities being disclosed to you. And a little bit more. As 185, as long as it is, Dasein always has understood itself and always will understand itself in terms of possibility. Just want to see if there's a particular thing I really want to pull out. No, I think that stuff up to 186 pretty much reproduces the kinds of points I've been making. I mean, he's saying a few things that are more technical than that, but if you've understood that point, you should be able to read those pages pretty clearly. Last time, in the lecture immediately preceding this, I referred to a place where Heidegger talks about, well, when I was talking about the notion of disclosedness or clearing, I said there's a place where he talks about experience as something like a kind of sight. Well, that's what he talks about here on 186 and 187. So I just mentioned that I had mentioned that I had brought that up before, and then he goes again directly into speaking about clearedness on 187, which was the theme that brought that up. Yeah. So, but I want to just now say one more thing about that. So I think this section should be pretty readable to you. The one thing that I want to bring out is this idea that, and I've said this before, but I want to just associate it here now with this section, with basically the notion of seeing as, right? That you are experiencing, the hammer. You're seeing it as a hammer. Seeing, well, not primarily visually, although that's involved too, but seeing in that broader sense. You're seeing it as a hammer. But you could see it as other things. Like if you have to prop the door open, you might see it as a doorstop, right? Hammer or doorstop. In each case, that's a significance, but it's a way of seeing what that is. And both of those things are in a way true. Like they are disclosures of that reality, right? They're not subjective representations. They are that thing being seen for what it is, one-sidedly. You're seeing it as this, or you're seeing it as that. Those things are true of it, but there are perspectives on it, and there are other ways you could see it too. The person who has to fix it sees it as a functional piece of wood and a piece of metal that have to be fit together, or the person who is a metallurgist sees the hammerhead and says, oh, that's an interesting piece of, whatever, iron and blah, blah, blah. That's another way of taking the same reality and truthfully seeing something about what it really is. So the point I just want to get at there is that understanding, seeing things as, is a real grasp of the reality of things. You are grasping what things are. Things are disclosed when you see them as this or that. And I guess that's the primary sense of understanding that we should be working with. What you are seeing something as, where that seeing as is always wrapped up in a network of other significances of how this fits with that project they're working towards, and ultimately how those things all relate to you, and so on. So I'd just like to bring that idea out as a notion for you to hold on to while you're reading that. I'm not going to say more about that right now, because I think I've said so many things over these various lectures that already pertain to this material that section, interesting as it is, important as it is should be relatively readable. I want to skip on now. He has some further sentences there about assertion and, what it is, this sentence that says this is that and so on. That stuff's pretty interesting and important, but I don't want to dwell on it right now. But I want to just skip to section 34, being there in discourse or language. And I'm just going to read a few things, and then I want to try talking about this a little bit, just to try to bring out a few kind of provocative ideas. So he says at the bottom of 203, Discourse is existentially equiprimordial with state of mind and understanding, right? So that means no one of these comes first. Every experience you have is always moody, meaningful, intelligible, and articulated. And then the thing he says right after that is the intelligibility of something has always been articulated. And then a little bit more. So I'll read this first. He says, 204, the end of that first paragraph there, he says, discourse too must have essentially a kind of being which is essentially worldly. The intelligibility of being in the world expresses itself as discourse. The totality of significations of intelligibility is put into words. To significations words accrue, but word things do not get supplied with significations. I think that's what I want to talk about. I just want to look for a second to see if there's another line I want to pull out here. I'm going to just stick with that. I'm going to talk a little bit sort of about that rather than sort of breaking it down sentence by sentence. But basically, generally speaking, the world, your experience comes to make sense to you as you come to put it into words. Like I think about my son. I have a 4-year-old son, and I think about him when he was, younger. He's dropped into the world. Stuff is happening, and he doesn't think, oh, there's my mom, and there's a bed, and this is a wooden floor, and I'm a baby, and there's air around me. Like he doesn't have that kind of articulated view. I think when he was born, his experience was kind of a wash of stuff washing over him. Not pointedly, not very articulate. And the progressive development of his actual grasp of the world, his coming to have an understanding relationship with the world, his understanding grew. His understanding became more articulate as he learned language, as his mom and I, through body language and through words that we expressed, gave voice to how to make sense of what that was around him that he was experiencing. And I believe that his growing into a meaningful grasp of things is the same phenomenon as his growing into understanding basically what's being said to him. It's in learning that language that he learns how to take that amorphous sense that there's something here to understand and turn it into something determinate and articulate. So the articulateness of understanding, which, when you step back and just think about things, it seems like those are just logical and conceptual relationships. It seems like those relations of understanding are just separable from words. And it seems like words are just a kind of a clothing, a kind of dressing we put onto already existent concepts to allow us to talk about them or something like that. But he's saying that's not the case. The words and the concepts come out together, right? In growing into a way of thinking about things, it is participation in language that lets you have that articulate understanding. And so in that sense, the understanding you have is already articulated, right? It's already language. And language, let me add a couple more things about that. He says, 205, right in the middle of the page, he's talking about communication. He says, in this more general kind of communication, the articulation of being with one another understandingly is constituted. Through it, a co-state of mind gets shared, and so does the understanding of being with. So I mean, I don't want to. I won't go into the context there, which would modify this a little bit. But the point I just wanted to get at is that in language and in communication, we grasp the intelligibility of things together, right? Language is the way we have of sharing the sense of things, sharing our understanding of things. And so in language, in growing into language, you grow into a grasp of the intelligibility of your world in the same move in which you grow into a shared perspective with other people. This is especially, these topics especially come up in Sites of Exposure in lesson 6 in chapter 2. So you should read that one to just see some more of this sort of filled out. But the really what I want to get you to think about is language. It's interesting, like, there's sounds, there are words, there are bodily gestures, there's marks on a paper, whatever they are. The language is those things, but it is those material worldly realities experienced as the shared grasp of intelligence, the shared grasp of the intelligible order of things. So that I only really get that sound as a word when I get it as revealing something that you get too, and indeed that anyone could get, anybody who could learn that word, could learn that language, right? So the very nature of words is that their very meaning is the shareability of experience. And what is being shared in them is basically how to make sense of the way all this stuff fits together. And so it's in words that we, through words, in and through words, that we come to inhabit that a shared world, a shared grasp of the intelligibility of things. So really, we're inhabiting language, which is the theme that I especially talk about here in lesson 6. And then there's a point I made before. I made this point when we were talking about the Jeff Wall picture about the apartment. And I talked about the woman reading the newspaper. And I was saying, yeah, she sees words on the page, but she doesn't see them. They're inconspicuous. They disappear from her perception, rather like the tool disappears when you're using it. With the tool, you're directed to the task, and through the words, you just get the meaning they're trying to present you with, right? So Heidegger says that on 207. He says, phenomenologically speaking, what we first hear is never noises or complexes of sounds, but is the creaking wagon or the motorcycle. So he's saying, in hearing in general, you don't hear sounds. You hear a car coming down the street. And something analogous is true of words that you read. You don't see you don't see whatever. IMGOINGTOTHESTORE. You immediately get the sense I'm going to the store. So that woman reading the book has the intelligibility of things immediately handed to her, and that happens by her participating in a kind of shared perception, a kind of shared world, a shared understanding, a shared way of seeing things, in that sense of seeing that Heidegger was talking about in the chapter of Understanding Sicht. Okay, that's enough of that. I still want to make one more point, but that's basically what I wanted to say, just to try to give you a sense of what I think the core point is that he's trying to make about discourse. The idea that how we understand things can't be separated from how we say things. And indeed, I guess to push this further, and this relates to what I was saying about those Jeff Wall works, we give voice to our understanding, right? Just like we get the terms for understanding through words, like the way we understand situations is such that they call for us to share our meanings with others. And so we talk a lot, right? That's enough to get, I think, the core sense of this. I mean, there's much to explore here, but I wanted to say enough so that you could read through these sections and start to explore some of the relevant philosophical points. And now I just want to make one point. Might have two sides, so there might be 2 points, but I just want to quickly say something about the last little bit. So I've just been talking about the first half of chapter 5, where he lays out mood, understanding, and discourse. But the second half is now he's saying, like, okay, and how do we usually relate to these? And basically, if you remember what we said in the last chapter, Division 1, chapter 4, we saw that our everyday way of being a self is to be one, or to be one of them, to be a they self. And so he says that characterizes our relationship with mood, understanding, and discourse. So he says, our everyday experience is the discourse we rely on is the discourse of the day, of the they, or basically idle talk. The mood we live with is the understanding we live with is curiosity, which is to say the trivial bouncing off the surface of things, right? Not a substantial engagement. And the mood we live with is ambiguity. I guess that's the mood. Am I right about that? I think so. You can go look at him talk about those things in more detail, but all I want to do is quickly make this connection that we can take what we said about the they as the everyday being of who you are, and say, okay, my way of existing is always to exist in this moody, understanding, discursive way. What is the they construed as a way of feeling, understanding, and talking? And I think it amounts to a way that we kind of bounce off the surface of the world and kind of act as if everything is always settled and understood apart from us. And like the world itself doesn't appear challenging; it appears, entertaining, or something like that. And we don't appear to ourselves as being matters of great existential moment. So I want you to read that section and just think about that, about taking these up in terms of the they, and then to think about what other possibilities they might be. That's what we're going to go on to. We're going to go on in the next chapter, chapter 6, to start looking at what it is to embrace that kind of authenticity that he hinted at in both earlier in section 9 and then in chapter 4 when he talked about the they. We're going to start talking about that more directly. But to get into that, I want you to think about the mood, understanding, and form of discourse, especially the form of discourse, which he calls idle talk, that characterizes one's existence as a they self. And you might think back to that picture of the Toulouse-Lautrec picture of the man reading the newspaper. So I'm going to leave it there, but I hope I've taken you through enough of that chapter just to give you a little bit of the text and to start getting you to think a little bit about these issues, and especially to start thinking about some exciting issues, what I think are exciting issues about language. And so we'll come back next time and look at Division 1, Chapter 6, and move on from there.